Hey everyone. This evening, we're stepping into 1976, the year America turned 200 years old and decided to celebrate like it had never celebrated before. From small town parades with crepe paper floats to tall ships in New York Harbor, from Bruce Jenner's Olympic glory, he won the decathlon in Montreal that summer, to Stevie Wonder's chart-topping soul. It was a summer draped in red, white, and blue. Beneath the bunting, there was a country still healing from Vietnam and Watergate, but eager to believe in itself again. This is the story of the Bicentennial Summer. If you'd like to hear more stories like this one, please take a second to like and subscribe. Now, settle in, close your eyes, unwind, and let the echoes of the past drift into the quiet corners of your mind. In that warm season, life moved to the slow rhythm of long days and softer nights, when even the hum of a radio in a nearby window could seem like the center of the world. On a warm July night in 1976, darkness settled slowly over neighborhoods from coast to coast. In living rooms, where the day's heat still clung to the curtains, and on porches, where wood held the memory of sun, radios gave off a soft amber glow. Their dials cast small shadows across coffee tables, the knobs worn smooth by years of use. Outside, cicadas hummed in time with the low conversation of neighbors leaning against porch rails. Inside, a calm voice on the AM band slipped between words and static, introducing the next song as if reading the day's weather. The music drifted outward, mixing with the scent of freshly cut grass and late-blooming roses. From one house came the light, airy harmonies of Afternoon Delight, a song that had climbed all the way to #1 that very month. A few houses down, an FM station was spinning Elton John and Kiki D's Don't Go Breaking My Heart, all playful warmth in the heavy summer air. And somewhere, on another frequency, Stevie Wonder's music, his Songs in the Key of Life album, added funk and depth to the night's wide-stitch soundtrack. It was an unlikely blend. The tenderness of a ballad alongside bright pop choruses and steady, confident funk created something bigger than individual tastes. These airwaves carried joy, longing, and the pulse of a country learning how to celebrate again while still aware of its scars. The sound of the signal became part of the texture. There was the faint hiss that filled the space between words, and the muffled pop as the DJ switched tracks. Thunderstorms far away sent a roll of static through soft passages. People sat close, a hand ready on a tape recorder. One well-timed press of the record button could catch a favorite song. Those homemade mixtapes, each with its hiss and imperfections, became souvenirs, holding the sound of that summer in magnetic spools. The DJs that summer often spoke like neighbors. One might give the time down to the minute, or mention a fireworks display at the lake the following week. Another, on a bigger station, could make a backyard listener feel part of something larger, a city's worth of ears tuned in together. Sponsors, too, slipped into the mix. A quick jingle for a bank, or a bicentennial tribute from a familiar corner store. Even those ads seemed to belong to the season. Some choices on the playlist stood out. Paul Simon's 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, with its easy, conversational tone about parting, was a curious match for the summer's parades and bunting. Yet there it was, sharing space with patriotic marches and disco hits. The national soundtrack didn't edit out personal troubles. It let them play alongside the public celebrations. These songs reached everywhere. A service station might have Afternoon Delight coming through a tinny loudspeaker while mechanics worked. In an apartment high above the street, a transistor radio might catch only pieces of Don't Go Breaking My Heart between bursts of passing traffic. In small towns, porch swings creaked softly to the same beat that played from jukeboxes in diners hundreds of miles away. The unity came not from everyone liking the same tune, but from everyone hearing them. Waves of sound passing invisibly over towns, highways, and open fields. In this way, the air itself was a shared space. No one needed to know who held the other radios to feel their presence. The last song before bed was theirs too. At a time when the radio dial held only so many options, the shared attention meant something. It made each broadcast a thread in a much larger fabric. As night deepened, playlists felt like patchwork, a burst of pop stitched next to a line of soulful brass, a quiet folk song bordered by dance grooves. From time to time, a short bicentennial message was read over gentle instrumentals, followed without pause by a bright pop single. Each track, no matter its style, added shape and color to the whole. For listeners, the effect could be subtle but lasting. Sitting in the low light, they might hear the bass line of one song give way to the gentle opening of another. The glow from the radio would catch the curve of a glass or the edge of a magazine. Across town, the same transitions happened in other rooms, in other hands. Differences of taste mattered less than the shared experience of those same notes, arriving at roughly the same moment across so many different lives. July's ritual repeated itself night after night. The turn of a knob opened a small but vivid world. The voices and songs tied together people who would never meet, stitching them into the same summer simply by being there, together in sound. When the last song faded and the switch clicked off, the sudden quiet felt thick with the memory of what had just played. And outside, the air held on to the noise of people. Voices on sidewalks, footsteps on warm pavement. Somewhere at the edge of hearing, the faint sound of a marching band hinted that celebration was already moving in from the distance. Main Street in July 1976 moved at its own steady rhythm. Crepe paper floats rolled past brick storefronts with windows dressed in hand-painted Happy 200th signs. The air was warm and faintly sweet, carrying the scent of grilled hot dogs from a volunteer fire department stand. That smell mingled with the popcorn drifting from a single metal popper set up under a striped awning. Small-town America had gathered in force. Folding chairs lined elbow to elbow along the sidewalk, the heat softened only slightly by the shade of trees and shop overhangs. Parades had always been a 4th of July tradition, but the Bicentennial added a weight that went beyond habit. Each paper rosette and ribbon seemed to be arranged with more precision. For many towns, this was the centerpiece of the celebration, a chance to display what their residents could build with wood, fabric, paint, and pride. Clubs and volunteer groups had spent months cutting paper, welding frames, and debating just how many flags would make the right impression without overwhelming the float's theme. Beneath the bunting, the memory of recent struggles lingered. Vietnam, Watergate. These events had left marks that didn't vanish in the summer sun. Even so, the pull of a snare drum and the sight of a neighbor's child tossing wrapped candy from a wagon had a way of softening the edges. Conversation stayed friendly, applause traveled easily down the line, and a shared laugh at a mule that refused to move forward could ripple through the crowd. The day was as much a matter of texture as of sight and sound. Handmade burlap banners shifted lightly in the breeze, their stenciled lettering a little uneven from garage work. Glitter clung stubbornly to painted plywood signs, shaking loose in small bursts whenever a float hit a crack in the pavement. Folding chairs gave off the faint squeak of metal on concrete as people shifted. Sandals scraped the warm surface when late arrivals tried to find space along the curb. Even the temporary barriers that marked the route grew hot enough to feel through a resting palm. Average gas prices that summer sat around 59 cents a gallon, and it mattered. More families could afford to drive in from surrounding farms and smaller villages. Station wagons and sedans from earlier in the decade lined the side streets, chrome bumpers catching the hard light. Children spilled from their doors into heat that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Hands clutched paper flags, many passed out for free by grocery stores in the weeks before, while melting ice cream ran over knuckles and onto the thin sticks they held. The heartbeat of the procession came from the music. Brass bands filled the space between floats, the flash of trumpets and trombones throwing sunlight into spectators' eyes. Bass drums sent steady pulses through the wooden viewing stands. The local high school band kept its lines and corners sharp despite the heat, plumes from their hats nodding with each turn. Veterans followed, some carrying rifles in the color guard, others in older uniforms or period clothing from the Revolutionary era, straightening as they passed the flag. Shopkeepers stepped outside when the music approached, leaning in doorways as their merchandise sat in dim interiors. A barber's pole turned slowly, its aging stripes of red and blue echoing the banners strung across Main Street. In the hardware store window, rows of polished tools alternated in red and blue handles, catching the eye of customers on their way to the curb. Above it all, church bells counted the hours, their sound familiar enough to thread into the music without breaking it. Some floats drew extra attention. A working miniature railroad built across the bed of an old trailer, a massive papier-mâché Liberty Bell, rocking slightly with each bump. People applauded the obvious effort in the handiwork. Nothing had the look of commercial polish. Even imperfect lines felt like proof of local work, built within a few miles of where they now rolled. Vendors wove among the chairs with wire baskets filled with soda bottles sweating under the sun. The hiss of a freshly opened cap was followed by the brief sharpness of that first swallow, a taste that cut through the still air. Pink and blue cotton candy caught glints of light before sticking fast to skin and leaving fingers dusted with sugar. Conversations rose and fell around these moments, kept just above the music without overtaking it. On the edges of the street, neighbors caught each other's eye in the pauses between floats. A wave here, a handshake there, quick exchanges from people who might have walked past each other all year without stopping. That single moment of recognition seemed as much a part of the day as the bands or the flags. Some families had arrived early to claim a front view. Picnic baskets waited on blankets. Coolers rested on tailgates parked in neat lines near the school field. A few radios murmured with far-off coverage from other celebrations, but most stayed local until the opening drumbeat signaled the start. Children, who had been chasing each other over the grass, dropped to the curb at the first sight of a fire truck. Arms reaching for taffy tossed into the air. Money was still counted carefully. Parents weighed each purchase. A small paper cone of snow ice or one soda was often enough. Yet the careful spending didn't seem to narrow the day. As long as the crowd's eyes moved together with the parade, other concerns drifted into the background. The rhythm of brass and drum pulled the town into one body. When the final float passed the last viewing stand, hands stayed raised for a while longer, waving to riders who leaned and waved back until the turn of the street hid them. A few chairs folded, but most remained open. The last chords hung in the air before trailing off into the quiet hum of a slower afternoon. A single cannon report sounded somewhere down the block, its echo fading into the brightness. In the hours that followed, flags still moved in the warm breeze along storefronts, their cloth edges whispering together. The smell of cooked meat and sugared treats faded slowly, and miles from these brick-lined streets, another crowd, far larger, was already gathered under a different strip of sky, waiting in still air for history to emerge where city meets water. Before the sun had cleared the skyline, a pale mist clung to New York Harbor. It softened the edges of the city and blurred the outlines of ferries at anchor. Out on the water, the tall ships waited for their cue, masts rising into the early light. Rigging tapped lightly against metal, a constant delicate sound beneath the low hum of voices. The air carried the smell of salt and diesel, and closer to shore, the warm drift of coffee from vendors already filling cups for the first arrivals. This was Operation Sail, Op Sail, July 4th, 1976. For the Bicentennial, the parade of sail had drawn vessels from across the globe into this single sweep of harbor. Months of front-page headlines had built anticipation, but standing in the damp air that morning gave the event a weight no article could reproduce. These ships, some modern, some built to designs centuries old, had traveled thousands of miles to join what was to be one of the most photographed moments of the celebration. The harbor would, for a day, become a stage that belonged to the world. Crowds settled into place early. They pressed against iron rails, sat cross-legged on the worn planks of piers, or leaned from upstairs windows overlooking the water. Some had binoculars slung around their necks. Others brought small cameras, winding back film between shots. Many simply watched, prepared to wait for hours. From Staten Island ferries to the Battery, every seawall held clusters of people. Their quiet conversations formed a low undercurrent that rose now and again with the sharp cry of a gull. No one was certain when the first sails would appear. The sun crept higher, shifting the mist across the water, but the horizon stayed empty. Every so often, an onlooker would point, thinking they'd caught sight of a mast, and for a breath, the crowd would lean forward. Then the haze would thin, showing only open water. Children shifted on their feet, distracted by the smell of warm pretzels drifting from carts along the promenade. The change came from the south, sudden and sure. Cheers broke out along the waterfront. Arms lifted, fingers aimed at something just becoming visible, and out of the mist, a shape began to form. Faint, white sails, moving steadily into view. At first, the decks were only shadows, but the height could not be missed. The lead vessel's canvas caught the morning light, disappearing, then reappearing as the fog allowed, each glimpse drawing a fresh rise in the sound from shore. Voices quieted as the first ship moved closer, the slap of water on its hull, and the soft creak of timbers reaching even to the crowd. More masts followed, angles and lines sharpening in the clearing air. Flags ran in bright lengths from their stays, deep blues, bold reds, and unfamiliar crests from far coasts. Among them were the Amerigo Vespucci of Italy, its trim, immaculate, and Norway's Christian Radich with its square sails hanging full. Standing among these vessels were representatives from Spain, Britain, and nations whose relations with the United States had not always been easy. On this day, they sailed side by side. The air thickened with scents as the morning went on. Salt stayed constant, but it mixed now with sausages browning on griddles, onions cooking beneath canvas awnings, and the sharp tang of mustard. Vendors threaded between the onlookers, calling out in short bursts, careful not to mask the sound of the harbor. At the water's edge, children balanced on lower rails, chins resting on cold metal, eyes tracking sailors as they climbed the shrouds and stood with easy balance high above the decks. From some spots on the Manhattan side, the tall rigging framed the Statue of Liberty. The torch caught the late morning sun, gleaming over the white sails and dark lines. It was the image many had come for, the statue that had stood through centuries of arrivals, flanked now by wooden masts from distant ports. Far downriver, President Gerald Ford stood aboard a Navy vessel, moving slowly along the Hudson to review the international fleet. The ships advanced up the harbor in measured intervals. Each hung back far enough to allow smaller boats and patrol craft to pass between. When a shift of wind filled a sail just right, the canvas bowed in perfect arcs. Cameras clicked and wound in steady rhythm, pausing only when cheers rose. Then the next set of masts appeared, and the cycle began again. Some along the shore understood the working language of sails and rigging. They noticed a well-trimmed jib, the precise discipline of a crew, or the clean, bright finish of a hull that had crossed oceans. Others didn't know the difference between a bark and a brigantine. It didn't matter. Every ship's presence marked a rare moment when the country's long-kept rivalries and struggles took a step back. In a decade when mistrust and economic worries weighed heavy, the sight of these vessels moving in quiet procession felt like a simple and certain gift. The line went on past what a single view could hold. By the time the last ship reached the battery, the first was already beyond sight for many. The pace left room to study each arrival like a separate note in the same piece of music. It was deliberate, unhurried, and complete in itself. By midday, the mist was gone. The harbor stretched blue and bright, water glinting hard in the sunlight. Flags ran color against the sky, snapping in the breeze. Heat rose from the pavement, along the piers, but the wind kept the air by the water fresh. Here, the only measure of time was the next ship coming forward, and the crowd's answering sound when it did. For many, this would remain the image of the Bicentennial. Foreign and local ships sailing past a restless city, past a shore-long crowd, beneath a torch of copper and gold. There were no headlines needed, no official speeches to hold attention. The meaning belonged to each person watching. When the final masts passed upriver, people stayed where they were. The clink of rigging grew faint, replaced by the sharper noises of the city reclaiming its edges. Vendors closing stalls, chairs folding, ferry horns sounding across the channel. The smell of salt still hung in the air, layered with the trace of food and warm wood. Gradually, the crowd began to thin. People stepped away toward subway entrances, bus stops, waiting cars. Groups talked over the morning, replaying the approach of the first sails as if it had happened just minutes before. On the decks of the departing ferries, passengers leaned on the rails, still scanning the water. And elsewhere, past the city's boundaries, a different kind of procession was setting out. Wheels pressed against gravel under the same July sun, ready to carry another bicentennial story, across miles of open ground. The slow, deliberate rhythm of wooden wheels carried across the summer air, joined by the softer beat of hooves pressing into hard-packed ground. Out on open fields, teams of horses worked steadily, the canvas tops of the wagons arching against the hot, blue July sky. Each creak of the frame seemed to reach back to an older memory, long before paved highways. Dust rose from the spokes in pale swirls, catching briefly in the sun before falling away to the trail behind. This was the Bicentennial Wagon Train Pilgrimage, a journey more than a spectacle. It had set out in 1975 from points across the country, bound for Valley Forge, where the different routes would meet on July 4th, 1976. The course they followed loosely recalled the wide arcs of older migrations, though the purpose here was remembrance rather than survival. The slow pace and open air made each mile a small act of tribute, as close to 19th century travel as most in that century could manage. Summer heat pressed in through every hour of travel. The canvas tops offered shade but kept the air still. Beyond that cover, the sun baked the soil until the smells of dry grass and earth rose in faint waves. Horses shifted in harness, tails flicking, breaths pushing slow and heavy in the warmth. Leather straps strained at buckles. Harness rings tapped gently, and the sound of hooves rang sharp on stone, muted where the road softened to soil. Clothing matched the era they sought to honor. Men wore loose shirts and wide-brimmed hats, vests faded by sun. Women's dresses picked up the dust by the end of the day, bonnets shading faces from burns. Boots, worn stiff by miles, rested in stirrups or scuffed along the path as some walked beside the teams on inclines. Around camp in the evenings, wagoneers tended both themselves and their gear. Shirts rinsed in tin basins, skirts brushed clean, leather checked for strain. The work was done with the same silent ease that came from repetition. At the fringes of each town on their route, people gathered to watch them come in. Cars lined the roadside long before the first wagon was in sight. Some children stood at the edges, craning for a view, small flags in their hands from earlier ceremonies. For those who had only seen such vehicles in books or static displays, seeing one in slow motion on a gravel road was different. There was the creak, the smell, the warmth rolling off horseflesh. The crews stayed within their roles, even when not moving. They spoke with visiting townsfolk in easy blends of modern welcome and the formal courtesy drawn from a remembered past. Stories were told in the cooling light, accounts of other crossings, of storms weathered, of good turns done by strangers along the way. Some of these tales belonged to history. Others were shaped for the evening, stitched from fragments of what might have been. Each wagon carried its marks of the road. Some wheels bore fresh oil at the hub, others a scatter of scratches from miles of stones. Tied-back flaps let air move through, revealing supplies inside: barrels, rolled blankets, cooking gear, lengths of rope, sometimes a crate of tools. Water buckets swung gently from hooks, surface trembling with the step of the horses. The air at close range was a mix of scents: warm leather darkened by sun, the sweet must of bundled hay, the tang of sweat and dust. Iron and wood gave their own faint edge, a reminder that forward motion depended on the integrity of nails, joints, and spokes shaped by hand. These details seldom appeared in photographs. They were known only to those standing near enough to smell them. Children studied the animals and riders with quiet attention. Parents explained in plain words that this was part of the country's 200th birthday. Older onlookers watched silently, more taken by the pace than the appearance. That pace, the long stretch between each hoofbeat, was a physical reminder of what the bicentennial meant to some. Not just the marking of years, but the act of moving through the land slowly, as if willing each mile to stay. Arrival in a town meant the day's travel was done, but not its labor. Horses were led to water, brushed down to clear the dust. Wheels were checked, spokes tapped to listen for any that had loosened under the strain. If repairs were needed, a blacksmith in the area might offer tools or skill. Meals became a meeting point. Stew from one camp supplemented with bread brought by a local family. By lantern light, visitors lingered, questions asked and answered in no rush. The rhythm repeated: pack, travel, halt, see to the animals and the wagons, rest. Each day offered a shift in views: the lie of the road, the reach of the trees, the angle of the sun at noon. The constancy of the chores belied the effort they took. Hands blistered, healed, and blistered again. Backs stiffened and loosened in the same half-dozen movements. Compared to the tall ships in New York Harbor, or the fireworks that would fill the television screens in July, the wagon train was smaller in reach. It held no synchronized display, no coordinated bursts of choreographed color. Its value lay in its closeness. Each step in the dust could be heard, each hitch in the harness seen. Walking alongside for even a short stretch gave a sense of both the strain and the steadiness. Some townspeople left speaking more quietly than when they had arrived, as if the wagon's pace had slowed their own. Photographs were taken, but what stayed longest was the texture: dry heat on the skin, the muted tap of iron, the tilt of a brimmed hat against glare. When they moved on, the road emptied back into its summer quiet, but the impression remained. The journey was not a reenactment measured in minutes. It was a steady line toward a meeting place that held meaning. By the time they reached Valley Forge on that July day in 1976, after many months, the wagons bore the marks of weather and wear, the people aboard bearing the same. For those who had followed, whether in person or by the reports and papers, the pilgrimage showed that commemoration could be measured in miles and sweat as much as in speeches. As that dust settled, other parts of the country were marking the anniversary in ways that needed no weeks of travel, no worn leather or sunburnt hands. Celebrations that fit on an end cap in a store, as easy to bring home as a box pulled from a shelf. By summer 1976, the national mood filled not only streets and parks, but store shelves. Ordinary products carried the colors and symbols of the anniversary, turning even a quick trip to the market into a walk through a rolling display of red, white, and blue. Soda cans, stacked in alternating panels, felt almost like decorations in themselves. A familiar cereal box now had a star-spangled border. Bread bags showed tiny drums and fifes printed beside their company logos. Even frozen food cartons and paper goods were paraphrases of the flag. Advertisers understood the appeal. That year proved the simplest way to catch the bicentennial wave was to wrap a product in patriotic colors and emblems. The approach went beyond groceries. Gas stations handed out commemorative tumblers or road maps illustrated with historical scenes in fine lines of red and blue. Hardware stores set American eagles or colonial motifs in their window displays, even on tools with no connection to that imagery. Department store ads came printed with mastheads redesigned in an antique flourish style meant to suggest the late 18th century. Some took the decorations as proof that commercial life had joined the celebration. Others wondered if so much applied branding drained the event's meaning into disposable packaging. As with many American occasions, commerce and commemoration moved in step, and the bicentennial made no exception. The commemoratives were the most direct examples. The United States Mint released special quarters, half dollars, and dollar coins with the dual dates 1776 to 1976 and designs of Drummers' Independence Hall, or torch rings. People often set these coins aside in jars rather than spend them, admiring their cool, smooth surfaces and sharply raised detail. For display, stores sold small plastic cases lined with blue felt to cradle a coin without it shifting. The U.S. Treasury also reintroduced the $2 bill on April 13, 1976, with an image of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, folding even day-to-day currency into the anniversary. Collectibles took many forms. Zippo lighters bore Liberty bells etched into bright metal. The firm click of the lid seemed to echo differently with that image in hand. McDonald's offered glasses printed with Revolutionary battle scenes in colored enamel, the designs giving a faint grain under a fingertip. Grocery store loyalty programs mailed out kitchen towels printed with stylized drums or dates in rich red inks in exchange for soup labels. The U.S. Postal Service issued an extended bicentennial stamp series, a far-flung gallery of historical figures, events, and symbols sent quietly from mailbox to mailbox across the country. When products felt different to the touch, it added to their pull. The edge of a new half-dollar carried a fine bite under a thumbnail. A limited edition carton's glossy board reflected light and felt slick in the hand, its print colors bright despite shelf time. A printed glass was smooth, except where the pigments of a flag or eagle formed a slight ridge along the design. The use of symbols was partly regulated. The American Revolution Bicentennial Administration controlled rights to the official Star and Circle bicentennial emblem, licensing it to companies whose products met its approval. The mark might sit neatly beside a chewing gum logo or appear on banners in shop windows. The odd pairing of a household cleaner beside a national anniversary seal was part of the look of that year. Many homes began, without planning, to collect these items. A pair of themed soda bottles might stand on a kitchen counter beside a coin set from a bank branch. A towel from a grocery promotion could be draped over the oven handle, used and washed until its red softened toward pink. Little by little, they built a quiet record of the year, an assortment more about the act of saving than the rarity of any one piece. Years later, finding an old coin in the back of a desk drawer might bring back a hot afternoon and the sound of a street parade heard faintly through an open window. Even more than parades or public concerts, these goods threaded the anniversary into daily routines. A refrigerator door might open to show a milk carton printed with a flag motif for no reason except the date. Children drank from promotional glasses at dinner without remark. Items faded and edges frayed, but they stayed in use long after the fireworks had gone. Not everyone took the flood of branding seriously. Some found humor in seeing bicentennial seals on shoe polish tins or cartons of orange juice. Others welcomed the abundance. For them, it was a birthday year, and there was a simple cheer in finding patriotic colors in the most ordinary places. The keepsake's survival owed much to their everyday use. What could have been novelties tucked away in cabinets became part of daily life, worn gently by it. Found years later in a cupboard or an attic box. These objects could bring back vivid fragments: the smell of sparklers, the murmur of a news anchor narrating the tall ships, the heat rolling through a kitchen with a fan in the window. In every kind of store, from corner pharmacies to national chains, the Bicentennial found a way to be present: printed, cast, etched, or stamped into goods that would make their way over thresholds. There, behind closed doors, they settled into the fabric of home life. They gave the anniversary a quieter echo, one heard in kitchens, laundry rooms, and garages, far from marching bands and harbor ceremonies. These were the kinds of details that could linger years after the official observances, when the public noise had faded, but the colors still turned up unexpectedly on a glass, a towel, or a coin. In those private spaces, the celebration didn't end. It thinned into a background note, waiting for the next time someone noticed it. On some of those evenings, that same undercurrent of national reflection moved in other ways, heard not in the clink of a coin on a countertop, but in the hum of a box fan and the blue light spilling across a carpet from the corner of a room. By the middle of a summer evening, the center of the house often shifted to the living room. Curtains drawn against the last light left the space with a faint, steady illumination from the television in the corner. Its changing glow traced shadows across the furniture and caught the reflective glint of framed photographs. A fan near the doorway moved the air enough to stir loose papers on a side table, its hum blending into the room's background. Program schedules shaped the flow of the night. Families tuned to Happy Days, where Fonzie's leather jacket and calm confidence contrasted with their own quiet routines but still felt familiar. A switch in tone brought MASH, its humor threaded with sobering moments set against the war backdrop. That July also marked the arrival of the game show Family Feud, debuting on July 12, 1976, with Richard Dawson at center stage, guiding contestants through quick-fire rounds to the same bursts of applause at home as in the studio. These titles held their places in the week, becoming anchors for evening habits. Households fell into a rhythm, built around half-hour blocks that offered comedic relief, thoughtful asides, or the easy suspense of competition. In a year when history was being revisited everywhere from classrooms to city streets, such familiar broadcasts were touchstones. The opening notes of each theme song were enough to prepare everyone for what came next without looking at a clock. Within the regular programming, the network set aside moments to underline the anniversary. CBS aired the Bicentennial Minute, brief nightly vignettes of American history delivered by recognizable public figures. Between cartoons on Saturday mornings, Schoolhouse Rock's Special America Rock series wrapped lessons on the Revolution and government in animated songs, tunes that would stay with children long after the credits rolled. News anchors brought a different timbre to the screen after the sitcoms and game shows. From behind their desks, they narrated footage of sprawling parades, tall ships at anchor, and the political shifts of the day. In that election year, the presidential debates between Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter drew large primetime audiences, replacing scripted drama with deliberate exchanges on policy and public life. The debates and the bicentennial coverage shared one thing with the comedies and cartoons. They unfolded in the same well-known corner of the home. Even small choices revealed how television settled into its role. Some households had the novelty of a remote control. a plastic rectangle with 2 or 3 mechanical buttons that clicked loudly. Many still relied on the solid resistance of a channel dial, turning it by hand, with a faint metallic stop marking each station. There was a sense of weight and permanence to the set itself, with its wood panel casing or molded plastic frame holding a screen whose slight curvature bent reflections of the room behind the viewer. The shared experience went beyond any single show. From high-rise apartments to farmhouse parlors, the glow and sound filling the living room was the same in outline. Commercials, too, joined in the Bicentennial. Breaks between programs featured products wrapped in flag colors or voiced over with mentions of America's 200th year. The branding introduced the same kind of visual cues in homes that store aisles had carried all summer. Evenings were not without their rituals. On some nights, meals and viewing happened together. A TV dinner in its foil tray balanced on a folding table might bring the smell of roasted meat and potatoes into the room, steam rising as eyes stayed locked on the screen. The combination of mechanical fork taps against aluminum and the laughter or applause from the set created its own kind of soundtrack. Children and adults alike learned the rhythms of the broadcast week. Saturday mornings belonged to animated blocks. Early weeknights might bring comedies. Sundays could end with a slower pace and headlines. Bicentennial events, fireworks in distant capitals, the passing of tall ships, were woven among the usual lineup. Through the camera's framing, viewers could see scale in a way that standing in a crowd might not allow. The stretch of a marching band, the sweep of flags waving over a harbor, the faces gathered along miles of streets. The screen acted as a kind of national mirror and narrator, reflecting both the intimate and the monumental. It gave context to celebrations viewers would never attend and placed them alongside dramas and competitions they knew by heart. The connection was steady, as if the same voice was telling every part of the year's story, blending spectacle and routine in equal measure. For many adults, the set's light marked the true end of the day. After work, after the small labor of a summer evening, they gathered in that one room, accepting the mix of comedy, news, and commemorations as part of the season. For children, the Bicentennial blended in among the rest. Another vivid animation, another minute of history, another friendly game show face, until bedtime arrived with the familiar final notes of a news theme. The end of the nightly schedule brought rooms back to themselves. The glow faded, leaving corners darker. The day's warmth still settled in the upholstery. Outside, porch lights dotted the street. Inside, the television had logged another set of hours, its images now committed to memory alongside the day's other sights. Somewhere else, beyond these quiet rooms and neighborhood streets, crowds were gathering under very different lights. The focus would shift from scripted lines and studio stages to open arenas where voices rose in unison. And the pace of the action was driven not by a director's cue, but by the race, the score, or the arc of a single decisive performance. The stadium in Montreal carried a low, restless energy that swelled whenever the runners took their marks. Tens of thousands of spectators filled the rows, flags shifting in the late summer air, voices layering into a broad and constant murmur. The lights washed the track in sharp white, catching the sheen of warm-up jackets as athletes paced or stretched before the call to their events. For viewers back in the United States, the bicentennial year had an extra chapter unfolding here: the Summer Olympics. Each moment carried through television into living rooms that followed every heat, throw, and vault. In the decathlon, the scoreboard told its own story, inching forward, event by event. On July 30th, 1976, Bruce Jenner, then Bruce Jenner, entered the final 1,500 meters, knowing the points they needed for the gold. The crowd rose with each lap, its cheers folding over themselves into a single push of sound. On the last stretch, Jenner's stride held, arms lifting at the finish in relief and exhaustion. The television camera kept them in frame, preserving the image for countless replays and securing their victory as part of the year's visual memory. Across the Olympic Village, a moment of a different sort had redrawn the sport's measurements. On July 18th, 1976, Romanian gymnast Nadia Comaneci completed her routine on the uneven bars without a single visible error, holding every landing without adjustment. The scoreboard, mechanical and never built to display a perfect 10.0, had to be reprogrammed to show it. The audience understood before the numbers stopped turning, their applause swelling into a roar. Watching from home, Americans saw in her precision the kind of calm excellence that needed no embellishment. The Olympic atmosphere reached far beyond individual victories. In the stands and across nations, the Cold War was a quieter undercurrent beneath the spectacle. Athletes carried not just personal ambitions, but the unspoken weight of national image. Wins and losses traveled home with meanings that reached past sport, received as points in a larger, ongoing tally. Not all of 1976's athletic high points came from Montreal. Earlier in the year, Pittsburgh had claimed Super Bowl X, edging the Dallas Cowboys 21-17 on January 18th. That autumn, in October, the Cincinnati Reds swept the New York Yankees in the World Series, their dominance sealed in 4 straight games. Those scores would stay fixed in short newspaper headlines and in the patterns of old baseball cards. In Montreal's stadium, the live scenes were dense with sound and movement, the surge of applause for a finish, the amplified crack of a starter's gun, flags snapping from their poles in the corners. Back home, the atmosphere felt different, but no less focused. Living rooms took on the glow of the broadcast. Chairs moved closer to the screen, fans leaning in during the last tens of seconds on a clock. The commentary threaded alongside the hum of a box fan or the clink of ice in a glass, drawing households into the rhythm of competition miles away. For many, these moments were marked in objects that stayed long after the games ended. Magazines pulled from corner store racks carried full-page photographs of Jenner's finishing stride or Comaneci's still frame mid-routine. Their glossy covers reflected light differently than the softer interior pages. Colors deeper and edges sharper. Felt pennants, printed with team names, weighted the corners of bedroom walls, their stitched trim fraying slightly with time. These keepsakes compressed a season's worth of skill and outcome into something that could be touched. Outdoor gatherings in that summer wrapped sports into their own settings. In backyards, grills worked under steady hands, while portable radios offered game updates between songs. At picnics, card tables sagged under the weight of sweet tea, burgers, and corn on the cob, with someone stepping inside now and then to check the television score. Taverns filled with low light, and the warm scent of fried food kept half an eye on the small screen over the bar. A sudden goal, or a race's finish, was enough to pull voices into a chorus, briefly overpowering the steady tone of the commentator. These victories became part of ordinary talk. To mention the decathlon was to suggest endurance and determination. A perfect 10 meant precision, even outside gymnastics. The series sweep stood for dominance, and the Super Bowl win for holding firm under pressure. Even those who didn't follow each sport knew the names from newspaper photographs, post-game interviews, and storefront posters that paired athletes with the Bicentennial's banners. The country saw in them a kind of excellence that was direct and unfiltered, a break from orchestrated pageants into the uncertainty of competition. Preparation mattered, but so did the day itself. In that way, medals, catches, and scores stood alongside tall ships and parades as markers of a year intent on displaying its best selves. Some of these memories fused with personal fragments. A balance beam landing could be tied, in recollection, to the taste of grilled chicken eaten in front of a black and white TV. A home run might bring back the smell of a leather mitt warmed in the sun during a long afternoon catch. The finish line at Montreal could be linked with the creak of a folding chair set squarely in front of the set for an evening broadcast. In homes, these were not distant spectacles, but events woven into the season's routines. In the mix of bicentennial pride, the summer's sporting triumphs gave people something uncomplicated to celebrate. Clear wins, earned in real time, witnessed as they happened. The skill, endurance, and precision fed into the same national appetite that hung flags on porches, painted curbs, and wrapped store windows in color. For a few minutes at a time, a race or a match was the arranged display, the shared ritual, and the unscripted drama all at once. By the end of summer, the flags from Montreal were packed away. Seasons were closing, and focus began to shift. Yet in scrapbooks, in stacks of magazines, and in soft folded pennants, the year's competitions remained visible. They rested alongside photos of parades or fireworks, each different in tone but part of the same national frame. And away from the stadiums and television cameras, signs of the bicentennial could be found on the scale of a single street, where everyday structures and front yards had also taken on the colors of the year, shaped by the hands of neighbors working with what they had. On a quiet suburban block in the summer of 1976, familiar streets were altered by the season's colors. Mailboxes that had been plain metal or painted in neutral tones now showed bands of blue dotted with white stars, or stripes measured out as evenly as the paintbrush allowed. Small flags on thin plastic poles lined front gardens, their bases pressed into damp soil after the morning's watering. Somewhere nearby, the hum of a mower drifted over the scent of cut grass, and a faint breeze lifted bunting so it tapped softly against porch rails. The work was largely improvised from what was at hand. Families salvaged cardboard for stencils, brushed stars and stripes onto scrap wood, or ran rolls of crepe paper along eaves. On one wire fence, strips of red and white fabric had been woven in a rough flag pattern, the weave sagging slightly where the summer heat loosened it. From the end of the block, the effect was uneven but deliberate, each house marking the anniversary in its own style. That lack of polish became part of the charm. A sign attempting Independence Hall leaned to one side. Its clock tower bled along the wood grain. Bunting hung between nails set at haphazard heights, and in sunlit spots, the red had already faded toward pink, deepening the contrast with the surviving blue. Up close, every piece showed the hand that made it. Visible brush lines, edges taped and repainted where color had strayed. Hurried touch-ups filled in after the main work was done. The scene's sensory mix tied it together. The sharp green of freshly cut grass lingered in the warm air, crossing with the smell of meat cooking on a backyard grill further down the street. Loose bunting strips and fabric accents caught enough wind to whisper or ripple faintly against walls. Standing still made the smaller details easier to notice. Bees moving through clover patches along a lawn's edge, or the faint chemical scent from a half-used spray paint can sitting open near a sawhorse. In thousands of neighborhoods like this, more than 12,000 local parades and events across the country that year, the Bicentennial unfolded at close range. Some small towns staged simple pageants beside schools or churches. A plywood stage went up on an open patch of grass, edged with striped canvas and flanked by potted ferns. Folding chairs stood in careful rows before them. Residents read aloud from Revolutionary letters, or children in plain costumes played fife and drum tunes that carried thinly over the shifting sounds of the audience. Just behind, card tables held pies in waxed paper wrappers, tall urns of coffee, and paper cups of lemonade that softened in the warmth. In city districts, the displays took on a more improvised edge. Shop windows hosted their own interpretations. Hardware stores set miniature cannons beside hand tools, barely visible through street glare. Clothing shops slipped tricorn hats or bright sashes onto mannequins. Bakeries stacked round loaves in a loose flag design, each brushed with enough flour for a white top stripe. Neon signs and window lettering stayed as they were, the new and the old sitting comfortably together. In South Bend, Indiana, the city's program to paint fire hydrants as miniature revolutionary figures added an unexpected spot of color to street corners. Fireworks shows grew from the same mix of tradition and local ingenuity. In rural areas, fairgrounds offered open sky on one end, blankets spread over grass that had already been pressed flat by parked cars during the day. Hand-lettered signs staked in the ground pointed arriving drivers toward fields set aside for the evening. In cities, a closed bridge or section of riverside pavement became the viewing stand. People sat cross-legged on still warm concrete or leaned on temporary railings, with the echo of each launch traveling up between storefronts before trailing into thin smoke against the dark. Behind each of these scenes stood hours of volunteer work. Supplies came from donations, reused materials, or discounts negotiated at local stores. Organizers borrowed ladders, tables, or trucks as needed, sharing what they had so the tasks could be finished. Meetings took place in basements or back rooms, informal but deliberate, with sketches of parade routes and placement of decorations spread out on tabletops. Each block interpreted the moment differently. Some streets coordinated exact color schemes, so the decorations matched from house to house. Others let every property follow its own plan, resulting in a long line of mixed designs, precision quilt patterns beside painted plywood cut in rough silhouette. In close-built row-house neighborhoods, strings of bulbs zigzagged high overhead, glowing red, white, and blue once darkness came. In wider areas, hand-painted signs posted along the road guided visitors toward whatever central spot had been chosen for that day's gathering. The impact of these smaller displays came from proximity. A full row of painted mailboxes announced a shared intention as clearly to the people who lived there as to those driving by. A store swapping its usual display for a bicentennial window scene became part of a larger echo heard in cities far apart. A fireworks show, planned, funded, and launched by townspeople, carried a different weight than any broadcast display. It existed only for those who stood together to watch it. These contributions repeated themselves in every direction. They wove the national story into settings that were familiar before the bunting and would return to their usual look after. None of them could define the year on its own, but together they filled the space between the large documented moments, adding a layer of participation that wasn't measured in headlines. They belonged not to history books, but to personal memory. In these neighborhoods, the spirit of that summer found consistent expression. There was no central script, no fixed timetable to meet. There were instead the chances to act on a feeling. Painting a fence, hanging fabric from a porch, agreeing on a handful of songs for a small public program. These were the closer, quieter ways of acknowledging the date. As August approached, the combined effect of masts in harbor light, wagon wheels on dusty roads, signals from stadiums, and these street-side tributes formed a continuous pattern. The bicentennial was visible in the care put into national ceremonies, but it was also present in the modest adjustments to houses, yards, and public corners. It was here, in gestures repeated thousands of times across the country, that the anniversary became part of ordinary life. And it was here, too, that its images would remain fixed in the mind, until years later, when someone recalled how a certain street or shop window had looked in the long light of that particular summer evening. That summer lived in more than one image or sound. It was masts rising through harbor mist, wagon wheels cutting through dust, the clean ring of commemorative coins handed across a counter, and music drifting from open windows at dusk. From stadium cheers to paper flags passed into small hands. Each moment found its place in a larger patchwork, giving the country, for a time, a sense of connection. If you enjoyed drifting back this evening, please like and subscribe. Thank you for sharing the walk through it tonight. Good night.